The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the vast expanse of the Double Eagle Ranch, where dust devils danced across the prairie like ghosts of the Old West. Sam McKinnon stood on his weathered oak porch, wiping sweat from his brow with a faded bandana as he surveyed his empire. 15,000 acres of prime cattle land that had taken him 25 grueling years to build from absolutely nothing. The year was 1887, and the American frontier was still a place where a man's handshake meant more than any legal document, where disputes were settled with Colt 45s rather than courthouse proceedings, and where survival depended on reading character faster than most men could draw their weapons. Sam had arrived in Texas as a young Irish immigrant with nothing but calloused hands, an unbreakable will, and dreams bigger than the endless sky above. Now, at 52, his silver-streaked beard and sun-weathered face told the story of a man who had earned every single acre through blood, sweat, tears, and unwavering determination. The ranch house itself stood as a testament to American frontier prosperity. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that provided shade during the brutal summer months. Margaret had insisted on glass windows shipped all the way from San Antonio, a luxury that distinguished the Double Eagle from the rough-hewn cabins of their neighbors. The American flag flew proudly from a tall pole in the front yard, its red, white, and blue fabric snapping in the constant prairie wind, a symbol of the opportunities this great nation had afforded an Irish immigrant willing to work for his dreams. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke Sam's morning contemplation. His foreman, Jake Martinez, a third-generation Texan whose grandfather had fought at the Alamo, rode up with urgency etched across his weathered features. Jake represented the melting pot that was frontier Texas, his Mexican heritage blending with American values of hard work and loyalty. His family had worked this land since before Sam owned it, and their bond transcended employer and employee. They were partners in taming this wild country. "Boss, we got ourselves a hell of a problem down by Willow Creek," Jake called out, dismounting his bay gelding with the practiced ease of a man born in the saddle. "Found tracks this morning. Looks like those Comanche raiders who've been hitting the Henderson and Cartwright spreads." Sam's jaw tightened as he absorbed this news. The Comanche situation represented one of the great conflicts of American expansion, a proud warrior culture clashing with the unstoppable tide of settlers seeking their piece of the American dream. Most Comanche had been relocated to reservations in Indian Territory, but some bands still roamed free, caught between their traditional way of life and the inexorable march of American civilization. It was a tragic collision of 2 worlds, neither entirely right nor entirely wrong. "How many tracks, you reckon?" Sam asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Maybe 8, 10 horses. They hit our north pasture fence pretty hard, cut the wire clean through, scattered about 50 head of longhorns. Could have taken 'em easy if they'd wanted, but they just spooked 'em instead and left 'em wandering." Sam nodded grimly, understanding the implications. This wasn't about cattle theft. It was about sending a message. The raiders wanted the ranchers to know they were still here, still fighting for land their ancestors had roamed for countless generations before the first European ever set foot on American soil. "Round up the boys," Sam ordered, already moving toward the stable where his prize stallion Thunder waited. "We'll ride out and see what we're dealing with. But Jake, tell the men to keep their heads cool. I don't want any shooting unless we're shot at first." If you're enjoying this authentic frontier tale of honor and cultural conflict, hit that like button and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more genuine Western stories to life. The riding party consisted of Sam, Jake, and 4 experienced cowboys who represented the diverse nature of frontier America. Tom Bradley, a former Union cavalry sergeant whose steady aim and cool head had saved the ranch more than once, carried himself with military bearing even years after Appomattox. Miguel Santos, whose knowledge of the harsh Texas terrain was unmatched, had been tracking animals and men since childhood. Bobby Red Sullivan, barely 20 but already proving himself as tough as rawhide, represented the new generation of Americans born on the frontier. Old Pete, a grizzled veteran whose exact age remained a mystery, but whose wisdom was invaluable, had fought Indians, Mexicans, and Yankees in his long and colorful career. They rode hard across the rolling prairie, their horses' hooves pounding a steady rhythm against the sun-baked earth. The landscape around them told the story of their harsh environment, bleached cattle bones scattered among the sagebrush and prickly pear cactus, the skeletal remains of longhorns that hadn't survived the brutal summer droughts that periodically swept across Texas like biblical plagues. Mesquite trees dotted the horizon, their thorny branches providing meager shade for the occasional jackrabbit or roadrunner, brave enough to venture into the open. The damaged fence line was easy to spot from a quarter-mile away. The barbed wire, that revolutionary invention that was taming the West, had been cut with precision rather than torn by panicked animals, confirming Jake's assessment that this was deliberate sabotage. But it was what they found 200 yards beyond the fence that stopped them cold and changed the course of this day forever. A lone Comanche warrior lay crumpled beside a massive limestone boulder, an arrow protruding from his shoulder and fresh blood staining the dust beneath him. His paint horse, a magnificent specimen of Indian horsemanship, stood nearby, nickering softly and favoring its left front leg, wounded but still standing, still loyal to its fallen rider. "Well, I'll be damned," old Pete muttered, adjusting his worn Stetson. "Looks like they left one of their own behind. That ain't like the Comanche I've fought." Tom Bradley's hand instinctively moved to his Winchester rifle. Military training died hard, and years of frontier warfare had taught him that wounded enemies could still be dangerous enemies. Could be a trap, boss. Might have friends hiding in those rocks, waiting for us to get close. Sam studied the scene with the careful eye of a man who had survived 25 years on the frontier by reading situations correctly. The wounded man appeared genuinely injured, and his horse's loyalty suggested this was no elaborate ruse. More importantly, something about the warrior seemed familiar. The cut of his hair, the style of his clothing, the way he carried himself, even in defeat. "That's Joseph Running Bear," Sam said quietly, recognition dawning. "I've seen him before, trading peacefully at Fort Griffin just 2 months past. He's not one of the hostiles." The Comanche's eyes fluttered open as the riders approached cautiously, their horses snorting and dancing nervously at the scent of blood. Despite his obvious pain and the gravity of his situation, Running Bear's dark eyes showed no fear, only the resigned dignity of a warrior who expected to die with honor intact. When he spoke, it was in the halting English learned from years of contact with white traders and soldiers. I do not run from death, McKinnon," he said, his voice steady despite his wounds. The fact that Running Bear knew his name surprised Sam, but didn't necessarily change the tactical situation. In this country, reputations, both good and bad, traveled far and fast, carried by traders, soldiers, and drifters who moved between the scattered settlements like human telegraph lines. "What happened here, Joseph?" Sam asked, using the English name he'd heard the warrior called at the fort. "Who did this to you?" Running Bear struggled to prop himself against the boulder, his face pale from blood loss, but his dignity intact. My young nephew, Grey Hawk. He listens to War Chief Grey Wolf, not to the wisdom of his elders. I tried to stop them from raiding your cattle, from breaking the peace we have worked so hard to maintain. When I said no more fighting, no more war, Grey Wolf's arrow found me. The story had the ring of truth, and it revealed the complex political dynamics within Comanche society that most whites never understood. Among the Comanche, as among all peoples, there were different opinions about how to deal with the changing world. Some, like Running Bear, advocated adaptation and peaceful coexistence. Others, like Grey Wolf, believed only warfare could preserve their way of life and their people's honor. The weight of decision, Sam McKinnon faced a moment that would define not only his character, but potentially the fate of everyone who depended on him. Every instinct honed by 25 years of frontier life screamed caution. Helping a wounded Comanche, regardless of the circumstances, would be seen by many as consorting with the enemy. The territorial authorities would question his loyalty, his neighbors might withdraw their support, and his own men could lose confidence in his judgment. But as Sam looked down at Running Bear, he saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being who'd been wounded for trying to prevent violence. The decision revealed something fundamental about Sam McKinnon's character, shaped by his own experience as an Irish immigrant who had faced prejudice and discrimination in eastern cities before finding acceptance on the Texas frontier. "Tom, Bobby, help me get him on his horse," Sam commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We're taking him back to the ranch." "Sam," old Pete said carefully, removing his hat and running weathered fingers through his thinning hair, "you sure about this? Word gets out you're harboring wounded Comanche, even peaceful ones, and some folks ain't gonna understand. Hell, the territorial governor's been talking about clearing out all the Indians, friendly or not." "Then they don't need to understand," Sam replied firmly, his Irish accent still faintly detectable after all these years in Texas. "This man tried to stop a raid on my property and got shot by his own people for his trouble. That makes him more friend than enemy in my book." As they carefully helped Running Bear onto his paint horse, supporting him to prevent further injury, the wounded warrior looked directly at Sam with eyes that held both pain and something approaching wonder. "Why you help enemy?" Running Bear asked, his English improving with each word as consciousness returned fully. "Because," Sam said simply, meeting the warrior's gaze without flinching, "I don't think you're my enemy, and even if you were, no man deserves to die alone in the dust for doing what he thought was right." The ride back to the Double Eagle Ranch was tense, with every man alert for signs of an ambush. The vast prairie stretched endlessly around them, broken only by occasional mesas and dry creek beds that could conceal a war party. But the landscape remained empty except for the occasional turkey vulture circling hopefully overhead and a roadrunner that darted across their path like a feathered bullet. By the time they reached the ranch buildings, Running Bear had lost consciousness again from blood loss and pain, his body swaying dangerously in the saddle, despite Tom and Miguel's efforts to steady him. The sight of their approach brought people running from the house and outbuildings, ranch hands, the cook, and most importantly, Margaret McKinnon. Margaret emerged from the main house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron and shielding her eyes against the blazing sun. A strong woman from County Cork stock, she possessed the same determination that had driven Sam to build his empire, but hers was tempered by a gentleness that made her beloved by everyone on the ranch. Her red hair, now streaked with premature grey from frontier hardships, caught the sunlight as she hurried toward them. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she exclaimed in her soft Irish brogue, seeing the wounded man draped across the paint horse's neck. "Sam McKinnon, what in the name of all the saints have you brought home this time?" "A man who needs help, Maggie," Sam said simply, using the pet name he'd called her since their courtship days in San Antonio. "A man who got hurt trying to do the right thing." Margaret McKinnon had seen enough frontier violence in her 20 years in Texas to recognize a serious wound when she saw one. The arrow protruding from Running Bear's shoulder had been skillfully placed, meant to disable rather than kill immediately, which suggested this had been punishment rather than attempted murder. Without hesitation, she began issuing orders with the efficiency of a field surgeon. "Get him into the spare room. Carefully now, don't jar that arrow loose. Tom, ride into town and fetch Doc Harrison, and don't take no for an answer. Tell him it's life and death. Jake, I'll need hot water, clean bandages, and that bottle of whiskey Sam keeps hidden behind the flour sacks." As they carried Running Bear into the ranch house, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that this single act of mercy would have consequences far beyond what any of them could imagine. The wounded Comanche had mentioned a war chief named Grey Wolf, and young warriors eager for battle, men who might see any kindness to their perceived enemy as an act of war itself. The spare room had been Margaret's idea when they built the house, a place for travellers, injured ranch hands, or anyone else who needed shelter. It contained simple but sturdy furniture. A iron-frame bed with a corn-shuck mattress, a washstand with a ceramic pitcher and bowl, and a single window that looked out over the prairie. Religious pictures hung on the walls, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the Blessed Virgin, and a small wooden crucifix that had belonged to Margaret's mother in Ireland. Dr. Harrison arrived 2 hours later, his black medical bag clutched in one hand and a skeptical expression on his weathered face. A veteran of the Civil War who had seen more gunshot wounds and arrow injuries than any man should, he examined Running Bear with professional detachment while muttering under his breath about the foolishness of treating hostile Indians. The arrow missed the major arteries, Dr. Harrison announced after his examination, but it's lodged against the shoulder blade. I'll need to cut it out, and there's no guarantee he'll survive the procedure. These savages don't always respond well to civilized medicine. Doctor, Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a steel edge that made grown men reconsider their words. That savage is a guest in my home, and I'll thank you to remember that while you're under my roof. The surgery took place on the kitchen table, with Margaret assisting and Sam holding Running Bear steady while Dr. Harrison worked. The Comanche warrior endured the procedure without a sound, his jaw clenched and sweat beading on his forehead, but never crying out or begging for mercy. When it was over, and the wound cleaned and bandaged, he looked up at Margaret with something approaching reverence. You are like the healing women of my people," he whispered in English. "Thank you, white woman." "My name is Margaret," she replied gently. "And you're welcome, Joseph." As night fell over the Double Eagle Ranch, Sam stood once again on his porch, but now his thoughts were far from peaceful. Somewhere out in the darkness, a war chief named Grey Wolf was probably planning his next move. By helping Running Bear, Sam had inserted himself into a conflict he didn't fully understand, with stakes higher than he had initially realized. Storms on the horizon. 3 days had passed since Sam McKinnon brought the wounded Comanche warrior to his ranch, and Running Bear was finally strong enough to sit up and take solid food. The crisis that had seemed so immediate now felt like it belonged to another lifetime, but Sam knew better than to trust the deceptive calm of the frontier. In his experience, trouble announced itself with silence before erupting into violence. Dr. Harrison had removed the arrow successfully, though not without considerable grumbling about wasting good medical supplies on hostiles. The wound was healing cleanly, thanks largely to Margaret's nursing skills and the natural resilience of a man who had survived 35 years on the Great Plains. Running Bear's strength returned gradually, along with his ability to communicate in English, which improved daily through necessity and practice. The ranch had settled into an uneasy routine that reflected the complex realities of frontier life. Margaret treated Running Bear with the same care she would show any injured person, bringing him meals of beef stew, cornbread, and coffee, checking his bandages twice daily and ensuring his comfort despite the suspicious looks from some of the ranch hands. Her kindness seemed to puzzle the warrior, who had expected imprisonment, interrogation, or worse from his white captors. Sam found himself spending his afternoons in deep conversation with Running Bear, learning about the complex political situation among the scattered Comanche bands and the growing desperation that was driving some toward increasingly violent solutions. These talks revealed a sophisticated understanding of the larger forces shaping the American West. The pressure of expanding settlement, the role of the railroad in opening new territories, and the federal government's inconsistent policies toward Native American tribes. "My people are like water in a shrinking pond," Running Bear explained one afternoon, his voice stronger but still carrying the weight of profound sadness. "Each year, the pond grows smaller, and we must decide whether to fight for the little water that remains or learn to live in the new world the whites have made. Some like me say we must adapt, must find ways to survive with dignity in this changed land. Others, like Grey Wolf, say we must fight, until we die, because living as prisoners on the reservation, depending on government handouts, is not truly living at all. Sam understood the analogy better than Running Bear might have expected. His own people, the Irish, had faced similar impossible choices under British rule: submit and survive as second-class citizens, or resist and likely perish in futile rebellions. The difference was that the Irish had eventually found ways to emigrate, to build new lives in America. For the Comanche, there was nowhere left to run, no new continent waiting beyond the horizon. "What about you personally?" Sam asked, genuinely curious about this man's philosophy. "What do you believe is the right path for your people?" Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the vast expanse of prairie that had once belonged entirely to his people. "I believe my children must eat. My wife must have warm shelter when the winter winds blow. The old ways. They are dying, McKinnon, like buffalo dying from the white man's rifles. I can fight the river that is sweeping them away, or I can learn to swim in its waters and teach my children to swim as well." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors, Sheriff Tom Morrison and his deputy, accompanied by 3 men whose bearing and dress immediately identified them as federal marshals. Margaret showed them to the parlor with stiff courtesy, shooting Sam a warning look that said trouble was brewing in their house. Sheriff Morrison was a fair man who had worked diligently to maintain peace in a county where tensions between settlers and Native Americans ran higher each year. A former Texas Ranger, he understood the complexities of frontier justice and had always tried to apply the law with both firmness and humanity. But the presence of federal authorities suggested this visit was about more than local concerns. It was about territorial policy and national politics. "Sam," Morrison said, accepting a cup of Margaret's coffee with obvious reluctance, "I'm afraid we need to discuss your house guest. These gentlemen have some serious concerns." Marshal Davis, a thin man with cold grey eyes and the bearing of a career bureaucrat, spoke before Sam could respond. "Mr. McKinnon, I'm Marshal Davis from the Territorial Office in Austin. We have received reliable information that you are currently harboring a fugitive Indian who has participated in armed raids against federal property and civilian settlements." "That information is incorrect," Sam said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man unaccustomed to being challenged in his own home. "Running Bear was wounded trying to prevent a raid on my property. If anything, he's helped prevent violence, not caused it." "Running Bear?" Marshal Davis consulted a leather notebook filled with neat handwriting. "You mean Joseph Waterhorse? He's wanted for questioning in connection with attacks on 3 military supply convoys traveling the San Antonio-El Paso road." Sam felt the ground shifting beneath him like quicksand. Either Running Bear had been less than truthful about his involvement with the raiders, or the federal authorities were operating on bad information and racial assumptions. Given the government's track record with Native American affairs, Sam was inclined to believe the latter, but doubt began to gnaw at his confidence. "Marshal," Sheriff Morrison interrupted diplomatically, his Texas drawl more pronounced when he was trying to defuse tension, "might I suggest we speak directly to the man in question? If he's well enough to answer questions, we can sort this matter out without anyone jumping to conclusions or making accusations based on second-hand reports." The interrogation that followed took place in the spare room, with Running Bear propped up in bed, but maintaining his dignity despite his weakened condition. Marshal Davis fired questions in rapid succession, clearly hoping to catch the wounded man in inconsistencies or contradictions that would justify his arrest. "Where were you on August 15th when the military convoy was attacked near Eagle Pass?" "Hunting buffalo with my son and 2 other men from my band, 2 days' ride north of the Nueces River." "Can anyone verify your whereabouts during that time?" "My son, Tall Horse, my wife, Morning Star, the buffalo I killed and brought back to feed my family and the elders who can no longer hunt." "What about the attack on the supply train near Bracketville on September 3rd? "I was at Fort Griffin, trading buffalo hides for flour and coffee. The post commander, Captain Williams, will remember me." Sam watched the interrogation with growing anger and admiration. Anger at the marshal's assumption of guilt based solely on race and circumstance, and admiration for Running Bear's calm, detailed responses that suggested innocence or at least non-involvement in the specific incidents. The federal authorities were clearly operating on the assumption that one Indian was as good as another for purposes of blame and punishment. The test of honor. The interrogation continued for another hour, with Marshal Davis becoming increasingly frustrated by Running Bear's consistent and detailed answers to every accusation. It became clear that the federal authorities were operating more on assumption and prejudice than on actual evidence, a reality that made Sam's blood boil with righteous indignation. "Marshal Davis," Sam said finally, his patience exhausted, "this man is recovering from a serious wound under my roof. He's answered every question you've asked, provided alibis that can be verified, and shown more courtesy than he's receiving. If you want to question him further, you can damn well wait until Dr. Harrison says he's fit to travel." "Mr. McKinnon," Marshal Davis replied, his voice taking on the cold edge of federal authority, "are you obstructing a federal investigation? Because I should warn you that harboring fugitives and interfering with territorial law enforcement are serious federal crimes. I'm protecting an injured man who sought help and received it under the ancient laws of hospitality," Sam shot back. "If that constitutes obstruction in your book, then I guess I'm guilty as charged." The tension in the room became thick enough to cut with a Bowie knife. Sheriff Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable, caught between federal authority and local relationships that he had cultivated over years of fair dealing. The federal marshals had their hands positioned near their weapons, though they hadn't drawn them yet, a sign that they recognized the political complications of arresting a prominent rancher in his own home. It was Running Bear who broke the dangerous stalemate with words that surprised everyone in the room. "I will go with you," he said quietly, his dignity intact despite his weakened condition. "I have nothing to hide from your questions, and I will not bring trouble to the man who saved my life when he could have left me to die in the desert." "Like hell you will," Sam said emphatically. "Not until Doc Harrison certifies that you're healed enough to travel without risk to your health." "The decision isn't yours to make, McKinnon," Marshal Davis snapped, his authority challenged one too many times. "We have federal jurisdiction here, and this Indian is coming with us today." What happened next surprised everyone and became legend in the county for decades afterward. Margaret McKinnon appeared in the doorway, carrying her double-barreled shotgun with the casual competence of a woman who knew exactly how to use it and had proven that fact on more than one occasion during Apache raids years earlier. "Gentlemen," she said in her soft Irish brogue, her voice carrying the unmistakable steel of a woman defending her home, "I believe my husband has made our position abundantly clear. This man is our guest until he's well enough to leave of his own free will. Anyone who disagrees with that arrangement is welcome to discuss the matter with me and my persuader here." In the American West of the 1880s, no man, federal marshal or otherwise, wanted to be remembered as the one who drew on a woman defending her home and hearth. It was a line that even the most hardened lawmen wouldn't cross. A boundary that separated civilization from barbarity in the frontier code of honor. Marshal Davis backed down with obvious reluctance, but his parting words carried an unmistakable threat that hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "This isn't finished, McKinnon. We'll be back with proper warrants and sufficient authority to overcome any resistance you might offer. When we return, your hospitality won't protect you or your Indian friend." That evening brought news that chilled Sam's blood and confirmed his worst fears about the consequences of his merciful decision. Tom Bradley, who had been scouting the northern boundaries of the ranch, arrived just as the family was sitting down to dinner with their unusual guest. "Boss," Tom announced without preamble, his usually steady voice tight with concern, "I found sign of a large war party moving south through the breaks above Willow Creek. Maybe 25-30 warriors, traveling light and fast." They're being real careful to stay off our land, but they're definitely heading this direction. Sam felt ice forming in his stomach. How far out are they? 2 days, maybe 3 if they keep moving at their current pace and don't push their horses too hard. Running Bear set down his fork, his face grave with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Grey Wolf," he said simply. "He comes for me, as I knew he would." "Why?" Sam demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You said he shot you for opposing the raids. Why would he risk bringing a war party here just to finish what he started?" "Because I know his plans," Running Bear said quietly. "I know where he intends to strike next, how many warriors follow him, and which white settlements he considers most vulnerable. But more than that, he cannot allow word to spread among the people that Grey Wolf shoots his own warriors for counseling peace. Among the Comanche, such a leader loses all respect, all authority. He must kill me to preserve his reputation." The full scope of Sam's predicament became clear with horrible clarity. By saving Running Bear's life, he had not simply defied federal authorities or risked the disapproval of his neighbors. He had inadvertently threatened the leadership of a desperate war chief who literally could not afford to let the wounded warrior live. Margaret reached across the table and took her husband's weathered hand in her own smaller one. "We'll face whatever comes, Samuel McKinnon," she said firmly, using his full name as she did only in moments of great seriousness. "We've built this life together with our own hands, and we'll defend it the same way if we must." Sam looked around the table at the faces of the people who depended on him for leadership and protection. His beloved wife, whose courage had never failed in 20 years of frontier hardships. His loyal cowboys who had followed him through drought, Indian raids, and cattle drives. And now, the wounded Comanche warrior whose life he had saved and whose presence had brought this crisis upon them all. The easy choice, the safe choice, would be to turn Running Bear over to either the federal marshals or Grey Wolf himself. It would end the immediate threat and probably restore his standing with the territorial authorities. But Sam McKinnon had not built his empire by taking easy choices, and he would not start now when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. "Tom," he ordered, "ride to the neighbors, Henderson, Cartwright, Miller, anyone within a day's hard ride. Tell them what we're facing and ask for their help. Jake, inventory our ammunition and weapons. Check every rifle, every revolver, every box of cartridges. We're going to need every advantage we can get if we're going to survive what's coming." "What about me?" Running Bear asked, his dark eyes meeting Sam's with unflinching directness. Sam looked at the wounded warrior for a long moment, weighing the man's character against the desperate circumstances that surrounded them. "That choice is entirely yours to make, Joseph. You're free to leave whenever you feel strong enough to travel, but if you choose to stay, you'll be part of whatever fight is coming to this ranch." Running Bear's answer came without hesitation, spoken with the quiet dignity that had marked all his actions since arriving at the Double Eagle. "I stay, McKinnon. Grey Wolf has forgotten the true honor of our people in his hunger for war and glory. Perhaps it is time for him to be reminded that courage means more than killing, and that leadership requires wisdom, not just strength." As night fell over the Double Eagle Ranch, Sam stood once more on his porch, looking out at the prairie that had been his kingdom for a quarter-century. Somewhere out there in the darkness, an enemy was approaching, an enemy he had inadvertently created by choosing mercy over expedience, compassion over safety. But as he contemplated the choices that had brought him to this moment, Sam McKinnon realized he regretted none of them. He had come to America seeking freedom and opportunity, and he had found both in abundance. Now, whether he lived or died in the coming confrontation, he would defend the principles that had made that freedom possible. The belief that mercy was not weakness, that honor mattered more than safety, and that a man's character was measured not by his victories, but by his willingness to do what was right, regardless of the cost. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just the strength and courage of the Double Eagle Ranch, but the very ideals upon which the American frontier was being built. That's the end of our frontier tale of honor, mercy, and the price of doing what's right. If this story of courage in the face of impossible choices moved your heart, please like this video and share it with friends who appreciate authentic Western storytelling. Don't forget to tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. We love connecting with our global audience. Subscribe for more genuine stories from America's frontier days, where ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges and discovered the true meaning of character.